They laughed at him. A 26-year-old lieutenant colonel with a slide rule instead of a battle plan, commanding engineers instead of infantry, talking about stopping the greatest armored thrust Nazi Germany had left to throw at the Allies. 600 men with demolition charges and rifles against an SS Panzer Spearhead that had just torn through American lines like paper. The veterans smirked. The staff officers shook their heads. Even some of his own men wondered if their commander had lost his mind. 3 weeks later, Hitler's last Western offensive lay broken in the snow, and the man they'd mocked had rewritten the rules of how wars could be won. December 17, 1944. The Ardennes Forest wore its winter like a shroud, pine branches sagging under fresh snow that muffled sound and obscured sight lines. In the pre-dawn darkness, Lieutenant Colonel David Perran stood outside a cramped stone farmhouse that served as the forward command post for the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, watching his breath condense in the freezing air. Behind him, through the doorway, a kerosene lamp threw shadows across maps spread on a wooden table. The maps showed what everyone already knew. The entire German offensive had punched through the American front with terrifying speed, and somewhere out there in the darkness, moving fast, was Kampfgruppe Peiper. Joachim Peiper. Even the name carried weight. SS Obersturmbannführer, veteran of the Eastern Front, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler's Spearhead battle group. His force, over 5,000 men, 72 tanks including King Tigers and Panthers, dozens of half-tracks and armored vehicles, supported by the best fuel reserves the Wehrmacht could scrape together for this operation. His orders: drive west to the Meuse River, seize the bridges, split the Allied armies, reach Antwerp, change the course of the war. His reputation: ruthless, brilliant, willing to do whatever it took to accomplish the mission. Against this, Perran commanded engineers. 600 combat engineers from the 291st, trained to build bridges, clear mines, construct roads, repair infrastructure. They carried rifles, yes, but they weren't infantry. They had bazookas, a few machine guns, whatever they could beg or borrow from retreating units, but they weren't an armored division. What they did have was explosives. Tons of TNT, cases of dynamite, primers, detonators, and men who knew exactly how to use them. And they had bridges. Dozens of bridges over rivers and streams that carved through the Ardennes. Natural barriers that meant nothing if you could cross them, but everything if you couldn't. Perran had done the math. He'd studied the maps until the contour lines blurred together, traced Peiper's possible routes with a grease pencil, calculated fuel consumption rates and movement speeds and critical bottlenecks. The conclusion was inescapable. Peiper's force was massive, fast, and deadly, but it was also a slave to logistics. Those tanks burned fuel at phenomenal rates. The Panthers needed about 2 gallons per mile cross-country, the King Tigers even more. Peiper had started with fuel trucks, but American resistance was already disrupting his supply lines. Every minute of delay meant more fuel burned searching for alternate routes. Every hour lost was an hour the Allies could rush reinforcements to block his advance. Every bridge destroyed forced him to find another crossing, and there weren't that many crossings. Perran could do math. But math didn't stop you from being terrified. The order came through at 0400 hours, delivered by a haggard captain from V Corps headquarters who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. You need to slow them down. Blow everything. Every bridge, every culvert, every crossing between here and the Meuse. Make them crawl. Perran looked at the captain. For how long? As long as you can. Hours, days, whatever you can give us. The 82nd Airborne is moving up, the 3rd Armored is trying to get into position, but they need time. If Peiper reaches the Meuse bridges before we can defend them. The captain didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what happened if the Germans secured a bridgehead across the Meuse. The Allied supply lines would be cut. The northern armies would be isolated. The liberation of Europe would stall, maybe reverse. This wasn't hyperbole. This was the moment. Understood, Perran said. The captain left. Perran turned back to his maps. His executive officer, Major Bill Mulcahy, stood in the doorway. Mulcahy was 38, old enough to have seen what happened when plans met reality, young enough to still believe you could beat the odds if you were smart and lucky. "Dave," he said quietly, using the familiarity earned through months of shared danger. You know what you're asking the men to do. Perran knew. He was asking engineers to stand on bridges and prepare demolitions while German tanks bore down on them. He was asking them to wait until the last possible second to detonate, because blowing a bridge too early meant the Germans would just find another route, but blowing it too late meant the Germans would be across and the engineers would be dead. He was asking them to make the kind of split-second decision that left no room for error and no second chances. He was asking them to trust his math, his judgment, his belief that this insane plan could actually work. "I know," Perran said. "Get the company commanders. We brief in 15 minutes. The 291st wasn't supposed to be here. They'd spent the previous weeks building bridges and maintaining roads for the First Army's advance into Germany. Unglamorous work that kept supply lines flowing and columns moving. Then came December 16th, the first day of the German offensive, and suddenly nothing was advancing anymore. Entire American divisions were retreating in chaos, some surrounded, some scattered. The 291st found itself pulled from construction duty and thrown into the gap, ordered to move east toward the sound of the guns and do whatever it took to slow the enemy advance. Now Perran stood before his assembled company commanders in the cramped farmhouse, their faces illuminated by the lamp's uncertain light, and laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Kampfgruppe Peiper is coming. We don't know his exact position, but intelligence estimates he's already past Stavelot and moving toward the Amblev River crossings. His objective is the Meuse. Our objective is to make sure he never gets there. He pointed to the map. We're going to destroy every bridge and every road junction he might use. Habimont, Tuapon, Mule, Trois-Ponts. All of them. We're going to crater the roads where we can't blow bridges. We're going to mine every approach and every alternate route. And we're going to do it while he's shooting at us, because that's the only way this works. Captain Jim Gamble, commanding a company, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, what's stopping Peiper from just going around? The Ardennes is full of roads." "Math," Perran said. "Fuel consumption. Time. Every detour costs him miles, and miles cost fuel he doesn't have. Every delay gives our guys more time to set up blocking positions. Peiper's on a timetable. Hitler gave him 72 hours to reach the Meuse. We're going to make sure he doesn't make it. And if we can't blow the bridges in time?" This from Lieutenant Ed Lamp, whose platoon would be handling the Habimont crossing. Perran met his eyes. "Then blow them anyway. Better to lose the bridge and the engineers than let 50 German tanks across." The silence that followed was the sound of men understanding exactly what their commander had just said. He wasn't ordering them to hold at all costs. He was ordering them to die if necessary, and to make sure their deaths accomplished something. "Questions?" Perran asked. There were no questions. There was only the work. They moved out before dawn, trucks grinding through snow-covered roads in the darkness, headlights taped to narrow slits that barely penetrated the gloom. Each company peeled off to its assigned sector, engineers jumping down with weapons and demolition supplies, officers consulting maps by flashlight, sergeants organizing working parties. The efficiency was born from months of training, but the tension was something new. These men had built bridges under artillery fire, but they'd never had to destroy them with tanks approaching. At Habimont, Lieutenant Lamp's platoon reached the bridge at first light. It was a stone structure, ancient and solid, spanning a small river whose current ran quick and cold beneath a skin of ice. Beautiful in its way, the kind of bridge that had carried farmers and merchants and armies for centuries. In 30 minutes, they were going to blow it to rubble. Lamp organized his men with practiced ease. Demolition teams began placing charges at the structure's critical points, the abutments, the arch keystones, the supporting piers. They worked fast but carefully, because explosives don't forgive mistakes. Each charge had to be positioned precisely, wired correctly, connected to the firing line. One mistake and the bridge wouldn't drop cleanly, might not drop at all, and then you were standing there with German tanks rolling toward you and nothing to show for it but wasted TNT and wasted time. Private First Class Tommy Rizzo, a kid from Philadelphia who'd been placing demolitions for 6 months and had gotten good at it, worked at the north abutment with hands that were steady despite the cold and the fear. "How close do we let them get?" he asked Sergeant Kowalski, who was supervising the placement. "Close enough that they can't stop," Kowalski said. "Far enough that we can run like hell afterward." "That's not very precise, Sarge." "Kid, nothing about this is precise. You do the math, you make the call, you live with it. Or you don't live with it. Either way, the bridge goes down." Rizzo nodded and kept working, packing the explosive carefully around the stonework, making sure the primer was seated properly. His hands were cold. His hands were always cold in December, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that came from knowing what was about to happen. They could hear it now. The sound carried across the snow-muffled forest, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Engines. Not just one or two, but many. The deep, throaty growl of German armor, distinctive even from miles away. The sound that Allied soldiers had learned to fear from North Africa to Normandy to hear, the sound of Panthers and Tigers and the mechanized might of units that didn't lose very often. "Finish it up," Lamp called out. "Wire check." Then everyone back to the detonation point. The engineers withdrew from the bridge in a disciplined rush, each man calling out "clear" as he reached safe distance. The demolition wire ran back 200 yards to a small rise where Lamp had set up the firing position, a foxhole with a detonator box and a clear line of sight to the bridge. Lamp crouched there with his second-in-command, Lieutenant Peters, both of them watching the road on the far side of the river. The rumble grew louder. Through the trees they caught glimpses of movement. Gray shapes, angular and massive, pushing through the forest. Then the first Panther emerged onto the approach road, its long 75mm gun sweeping left and right, commander visible in the open turret hatch scanning for threats. Behind it came another, then a half-track full of Panzer Grenadiers. Then more tanks, a column that seemed to have no end. "Jesus Christ," Peters whispered. "That's a lot of armor." Lamp had his hand on the detonator handle. His orders were clear: wait until the lead elements were committed to the bridge, then blow it. Too early and they'd just stop, find another route. Too late and they'd be across. The timing had to be perfect, and perfect was a window measured in seconds. The lead Panther reached the bridge approach. Slowed. The commander was looking at the bridge, probably wondering if it was mined, if this was a trap, whether to risk it or call up engineers to check it first. Every second of hesitation was a gift. Every second meant more German vehicles were piling up on the approach road, more of Peiper's precious fuel burning while his Spearhead sat idle. Make a decision, Lamp thought. Cross or don't cross, but make a decision. The Panther's engine roared. The tank lurched forward onto the bridge, 50 tons of steel and armor rolling over stone that had stood for 200 years. The structure creaked under the weight. The commander was still in the turret, confident now, waving the vehicles behind him forward. Lamp waited. The Panther was 1/3 of the way across. Halfway. 2/3. Almost to the far side, almost clear, and behind it a second Panther was starting onto the span. And this was it, this was the moment. If he waited any longer they'd be across and it would all be for nothing. He twisted the handle. The detonator fired. The electrical impulse ran down the wire at the speed of light, reached the primers, and the world came apart. The explosion was enormous. A physical hammer blow of sound and pressure that flattened the snow on the ground and sent shock waves rippling through the trees. The charges detonated in sequence, perfectly timed, and the bridge's stone arches shattered. For a frozen instant the structure seemed to hang there, defying physics, and then it collapsed. The lead Panther, caught on the far side, managed to lurch forward onto solid ground. The second Panther, still on the bridge when it went down, dropped 30 feet into the river in a cascade of stone and snow. The tank crashed through the ice, water fountaining up around it, and then it was gone, disappeared into the current beneath the wreckage. The sound echoed and re-echoed through the valley, fading slowly into shocked silence. On the German approach road, the column had stopped. Through binoculars, Lamp could see officers dismounting, gathering at the ruined bridge, gesturing and shouting. The lead Panther, stranded on the wrong side, couldn't go forward. There were no roads ahead that could support its weight, and couldn't go back. One tank, cut off and useless, exactly what Perran had calculated would happen. "Pack it up," Lamp said quietly. "We've got another bridge to blow." At Tuapon, the scenario repeated with different details but the same brutal arithmetic. Captain Gamble's engineers had prepared the crossing with textbook precision, charges placed and wired, security posted, detonation point selected. When the Germans arrived, 3 Panthers and a company of infantry in half-tracks. Gamble let them get close enough to see the bridge clearly, close enough to think they could take it intact, before he sent the whole thing into the ravine. At Mule, the engineers weren't quite fast enough. Peiper's reconnaissance elements arrived while the demolition teams were still working, and suddenly there was small arms fire cracking across the river and engineers diving for cover and sergeants screaming to finish the job. Private Eddie Mason took a round through the shoulder while connecting the last wire, but he got it connected before he went down, and Lieutenant Chuck Hensel blew the bridge with German infantry only 50 yards away. Mason survived. The bridge didn't. At Trois-Ponts, where 3 rivers converged and 3 bridges offered crossing points, the fight became something close to conventional battle. Peiper arrived with his full force, desperate now, behind schedule and running low on fuel, and he threw everything he had at the engineers defending the town. The 291st, reinforced by elements of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion and some infantry stragglers who'd attached themselves to any unit still fighting, turned the place into a fortress of rubble and explosives. They blew 2 bridges before Peiper could take them. The 3rd bridge, the critical one, the one that led west toward the Meuse, they defended house by house, room by room, buying time for more demolitions to be prepared on roads beyond the town. Perran was there, moving between positions with Mulcahy and a small command group, directing traffic like a conductor managing an orchestra of destruction. He'd set up a command post in the basement of a half-destroyed building, maps spread on a door balanced across sawhorses, radio operators calling in reports from across the sector. The news was coming in fast. Bridge down at Habimont, bridge down at Tuapon, heavy fighting at Mule but bridge destroyed, Trois-Ponts holding but under intense pressure. "Sir," one of the radio operators called out, "Captain Gamble reports Peiper is moving south, trying to find alternate crossings." Perran traced the routes on his map. South meant the roads through Cheneuse and La Glise, secondary routes that were narrower and harder to navigate. He'd already sent engineers to those locations. "Tell Gamble to prepare demolitions at every road junction. I don't care if it's a bridge or just a stretch of road. If it looks like a route for armor, crater it." The operator relayed the message. Perran studied the map, doing the math again in his head. Peiper had started on December 17th with maybe enough fuel for 150 miles of movement, assuming perfect conditions and no significant delays. But conditions weren't perfect. Every detour added miles. Every stop to figure out alternate routes burned fuel while the engines idled. Every engagement with defending forces meant maneuvering, which meant more consumption. And now it was December 18th, and Peiper hadn't even crossed the Amblève River yet, let alone reached the Somme or gotten anywhere near the Meuse. The math was working. The insane plan was actually working. "Dave," Mulcahy said, pointing to another spot on the map, "we've got reports of German armor pushing toward La Glise. That's the last good route north of here. How many engineers do we have in that sector? Maybe a platoon. They were supposed to be preparing a supply depot. Get them on demo duty. I want every approach to La Glise blocked or mined. If Peiper wants that town, make him pay for every yard." Mulcahy relayed the orders. Outside, the sound of tank fire echoed through the streets, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper thump of bazookas. The defense of Trois-Ponts was holding, but it couldn't hold forever. Engineers weren't infantry, and eventually numbers and armor would tell. "Sir," another radio operator called, "we're getting reports from other sectors. The 30th Infantry Division is establishing positions at Malmedy. The 82nd Airborne is moving into Werbomont. They say they need 12 more hours to get fully set up. 12 hours. Half a day. In normal times, 12 hours was nothing. In war, with the front collapsing and the enemy advancing, 12 hours was everything. It was the difference between a defensive line and a rout, between containment and breakthrough, between stopping Hitler's offensive and watching it succeed. "We'll give them 12 hours, Perran said. It wasn't bravado. It was math. If they could keep Peiper bottled up, Keep him burning fuel searching for crossings that didn't exist anymore. Keep him fighting for towns and roads instead of racing toward his objective. 12 hours was achievable. Barely, but achievable. The battle for Trois-Ponts lasted through the day and into the night. The engineers held the western edge of town until the last bridge was wired and ready. Then they blew it in a massive eruption that sent stone and timber and water sheeting across the ruins. German infantry tried to force a crossing with improvised rafts and found themselves under fire from engineers who'd transitioned seamlessly from demolition work to defensive combat. The Panthers sat on the eastern bank, too heavy to cross, their guns hammering buildings across the river but unable to advance. By midnight on December 18th, Peiper's Spearhead had been stopped cold. The next morning, December 19th, reconnaissance reports confirmed what Perran had predicted. Kampfgruppe Peiper had fragmented into smaller columns, each searching desperately for a way west. The main body was stalled near La Glise, surrounded by destroyed bridges and cratered roads. A smaller force had pushed south toward Chenus and run straight into a minefield laid by the 291 STC Company, losing 3 half-tracks and pulling back under heavy fire. Another group had tried to find a crossing near Stuapon and encountered elements of the 30th Infantry Division, now fully in position and ready to fight. The fuel situation was becoming critical for the Germans. Peiper's force had started the offensive with captured American fuel dumps providing crucial supplies, but those had run out. German supply columns trying to push forward were getting hit by Allied airstrikes now that the weather had cleared. The Panthers and Tigers were reduced to short movements, husbanding every gallon, unable to maneuver freely. Tanks that ran dry were abandoned. The Spearhead was losing its edge. Perran stood in the cold morning light outside a new command post in Habimont, watching supply trucks roll past carrying ammunition and rations for the growing Allied presence. The 82nd Airborne had transformed the area into a fortress. The 3rd Armored Division was taking up positions to the north. What had been a gaping hole in the American line 3 days ago was now a wall of men and guns, and Kampfgruppe Peiper was on the wrong side of it. "Message from V Corps, sir," an aide said, handing Perran a radio transcript. Perran read it. The message was simple: hold positions. Continue interdiction operations. You have bought us the time we needed. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, then looked out at the snowy landscape. The Ardennes stretched away in all directions, beautiful and deadly, the kind of terrain that could hide an army or swallow one. Somewhere out there, Joachim Peiper was realizing that his offensive was over. Maybe he'd realized it yesterday. Maybe he was just now accepting it. Either way, the math had won. The final days of Kampfgruppe Peiper's operation played out with mathematical inevitability. Trapped in and around La Glise, out of fuel, out of ammunition, under constant air attack, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and led his surviving men on foot through the forest back to German lines. They left behind 50 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and countless other vehicles. The armored Spearhead that was supposed to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp in 72 hours had traveled barely 50 miles and accomplished nothing. The broader German offensive continued for weeks, bloody and desperate, but without Peiper's breakthrough in the north, the whole operation lost its coherence. The southern thrust stalled. The center bogged down in brutal fighting around Bastogne. By mid-January, the Germans were retreating, having spent irreplaceable reserves of men and material for no strategic gain. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had lost, but the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion wasn't done. Through January and February, Perran's engineers returned to their original mission, building bridges. The difference was that now they were building them over the Rhine, supporting the final Allied advance into the heart of Germany. They constructed Bailey bridges under fire, assembled pontoon bridges in darkness, kept the supply lines flowing as American armor poured east. When other engineer units said a crossing was impossible, the 291st figured out how to do it anyway. They were the first Allied engineers across the Rhine at Remagen, the first to establish secure bridgeheads at multiple crossing points, the first to prove that the river everyone thought was impassable could be conquered with enough skill and audacity and carefully calculated risk. On March 7, 1945, when the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was captured intact and American forces began pouring across, it was the 291st that reinforced the structure, built alternate crossings when the original bridge collapsed, and kept the bridgehead supplied against German counterattacks. Perran was there, doing what he did best, turning impossible assignments into accomplished facts through a combination of engineering knowledge, tactical brilliance, and sheer bloody-minded determination. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The 291st had fought from Normandy to the Rhine, from the Bulge to the heart of Germany. They'd built bridges, blown bridges, built them again. They'd fought when they had to, ran when they could, and never once failed to accomplish their mission. They'd lost men, engineers died just like infantry, just like tankers, just like everyone else who goes to war, but they'd saved countless others by buying time when time was the most precious commodity on the Western Front. David Perran came home with a chest full of medals. The 291st received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions during the Battle of the Bulge, the highest unit award the U.S. Army can bestow. The citation specifically mentioned the bridge demolitions that stopped Kampfgruppe Peiper and the subsequent combat operations that helped contain the German offensive. It was recognition that engineers, despite being traditionally seen as support troops, had fought and bled and died to win a decisive battle. Years later, Perran wrote a memoir called First Across the Rhine, chronicling the 291st's experiences from D-Day to VE Day. He wrote about the bridges and the calculations and the impossible decisions. He wrote about the men who stood on those bridges while tanks approached, who waited until the last second to twist the detonator handle, who ran like hell afterward and sometimes made it and sometimes didn't. He wrote about the strange arithmetic of war, where success is measured not in ground taken or enemies killed, but in minutes delayed, fuel burned, opportunities denied. He dedicated the book to the engineers who never came home. What David Perran understood, and what most people never learned about the Battle of the Bulge, was that wars are ecosystems of interconnected actions. The infantry divisions get the glory. The armor divisions get the headlines. The paratroopers get the movies. But wars are won by logistics, by timing, by the unglamorous work of people who build and destroy and calculate and take terrible risks for objectives that won't make sense until years later when historians piece together what actually happened. Kampfgruppe Peiper had everything. Elite troops, superior armor, the element of surprise, a bold plan, and Hitler's personal backing. What it didn't have was fuel and time and unblown bridges. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion gave it none of those things. 600 engineers with demolition charges and rifles stopped 5,000 SS troops with 72 tanks. Not by fighting them head-on, but by making their advance impossible. By turning geography into an ally. By understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand exposed on a bridge and wait for enemy tanks to get close enough that when you blow the charges, there's no way they can cross. The history books remember the Battle of the Bulge as the last great German offensive, the moment when Hitler gambled everything and lost. They remember Bastogne and the 101st Airborne's famous reply to the German surrender demand. Nuts. They remember Patton's Third Army driving north to relieve the siege. They remember the cold and the casualties and the eventual Allied victory. Some of them remember the engineers. Not many, but some. There's a mathematics to memory just like there's a mathematics to war. The dramatic gets remembered. The heroic gets celebrated. The essential gets forgotten unless someone makes the effort to write it down, to tell the story, to explain that yes, infantry matters and armor matters and air power matters, but sometimes what matters most is a 26-year-old lieutenant colonel with a slide rule and a crazy idea, commanding 600 engineers who were willing to bet their lives that the math would work. It did work. The bridges came down. The advance stopped. The offensive failed. The war went on, but it went on in a direction that led to Allied victory instead of renewed stalemate. All because some engineers stood their ground and did the work and made the terrible calculations and twisted the handles at exactly the right moment. David Perran lived until 1999, long enough to see the Cold War end, long enough to see the kind of world his generation had fought to create. He never claimed to be a hero. When people asked about the Bulge, he talked about his men, about the sergeants and lieutenants and privates who did the actual work while he just pointed at maps and did math. He was proud of what they'd accomplished, but he was under no illusions about what war was or what it cost. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was deactivated in 1946, its veterans scattering to civilian life, carrying memories of bridges built and blown, of frozen forests and impossible missions, of standing on the edge of history and nudging it in the right direction through sheer determination and expertly placed explosives. Wars are not only won by tanks and infantry. Sometimes they are won by timing, by calculation, by understanding that delay can be as decisive as victory, that denying the enemy what he needs is as effective as destroying what he has. Sometimes they are won by engineers who everyone dismissed as support troops until the day those engineers saved the entire front. The men who blew the bridges in the Ardennes didn't do it for glory. They did it because someone had to, and they were the ones who knew how, and when the moment came they made the right choice. That's not dramatic enough for most war stories. There's no climactic bayonet charge, no heroic last stand, no medal-worthy display of personal courage under fire. Just math and timing and explosives and nerve. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Changed everything. So here's the question I want to leave you with. How many other stories like this are out there? How many times has history turned on decisions made by people whose names we'll never know, doing work that doesn't make for good headlines but makes all the difference between victory and defeat? How many David Perrans are there, scattered through every war, every conflict, every moment when everything hung in the balance and someone had to make the call? If you found this story meaningful, if it changed how you think about war or history or the people who fight in circumstances most of us can't imagine, do me a favor, hit the like button below this video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into the moments that shaped the world. And tell me in the comments, do you think modern wars still depend on individuals like David Perran? Or has technology changed the equation entirely? Thanks for listening. And remember, the next time someone tells you that engineers aren't real soldiers, remind them about December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, and 600 men who stopped Hitler's last gamble with nothing but explosives and nerve.